Hi, Internet. It's Emily SW.
Sam.
And we are coming at you with your favorite Gothic literature podcast with the next installment, which is Mad Science. We've done vampires and witches. And
That's it.
That's it. And now we're on to Mad Science.
This one's going to be a little different. With the vampires and the witches, we talked about how those sorts of characters changed throughout the years. But I don't think that the character of the scientist has really changed.
No, he kind of represents the same sorts of ideas continually.
The situations for the character evolve depending on the anxieties of the era, but the actual character and what he represents does not change.
Yeah, and his kind of moral failings are all the same.
Right. So we kind of have a list of just different tropes that they commonly embody. We're going to talk about a few different examples and how they embody those tropes.
Yes.
Ideas and societal concerns.
The originators. We're going to talk about the forefathers of the modern mad scientists in Gothic literature that you can still see today. Just, the technology is different. It's in big movies on the big screen, IMAX, whatever. But same idea.
I'm going to say, basically any, sci-fi villain could fall into this character type.
Yeah, basically anything where some sort of science goes too far, it's technically a mad science trope. Right. Even if he doesn't have crazy hair and goggles and is screaming up at the lightning in the sky, like that iconic image from the Frankenstein movie, right?
That did not happen in the novel.
No.
Let's get into that.
Yeah, no, speaking of Victor Frankenstein in the novel was a bit of a whiny.
Oh, Victor. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus.
Yeah, one of the original science fiction, if not the original science fiction novel.
Yeah, and the first example on our list.
Yes, and Mary Shelley, notedly, very goth. Not just gothic, goth. Mary Shelley, goth. And she wrote a gothic masterpiece with basically one of the original mad scientists. Pretty much the earliest example. And Victor, oh boy.
Where do you begin with Victor? Victor wasn't going into his experiments with a scientific frame of mind.
No, he kind of, his mom died, and then he had kind of a breakdown. And he's like, I'm going to create life.
Right, but the way he was going to do that was with alchemy.
Yes, which we have discussed in previous installments about witchcraft.
Yeah, so we're kind of starting off in a little bit of a magical realm.
Well, alchemy is the meeting of science and magic, so it's fitting to continue our theme exploration from the year of the witch into the year of the mad scientist.
Yes.
With Frankenstein.
He was trying to do alchemy, and he was at university, and all his professors kept trying to tell him, no, stop.
That's a common thing.
No, stop.
Yeah. The mad scientist of the story is usually told by other people, whoa, hey, calm down. And then they don't.
He didn't.
No.
He didn't. He pieced together a body from other bodies.
A monster, you might say.
Yes, and then brought it to life with a spark.
Yes, he brought it to life, and then, an irresponsible father went, oh shit, I didn't think about this. And then he abandoned it.
The book itself does not really describe in detail how he does it.
No, the book is more about Victor running away from his responsibilities and the monster killing people as a result.
Right. Whereas in the film version, every film version, I think, even the Thomas Edison one that I watched ages ago, they showed the monster coming to life with a reversed frame of this thing melting in a cooking pot.
Oh, grody.
But it was reversed, so instead of melting, it was going back together. Yeah, it's actually pretty gross.
Yeah, that sounds pretty gross.
And of course, what you mentioned before, the very famous scene from the Universal movie, lightning storm, and the whole apparatus that he's got, and the shouting that he has become God.
It's alive!
Which takes me to I think, the most important trope about the mad scientist. The most important mindset they have is that they think they are like God.
Yeah, they think they can thwart life, death, create life, get around, circumvent death.
Yeah, which is what a lot of them do. And there's a certain arrogance in the face of mortality. They think that the rules don't apply to.
The balance of the world becomes obstructed, and then it eventually, like, basically the mad scientist stories are about that balance being thwarted and then righted again. Like, the mad scientist is defeated and the world goes back to its kind of normal cycles, its regular rhythms, its regular balance. The mad scientist never comes out on top of that equation.
No, because
the mad scientist is not God.
No, his pride always leads to his downfall. In the case of we're just gonna keep calling him Victor.
Victor.
He creates this monster. The monster in the novel is intelligent. It speaks to him. It speaks to other people. It's capable of higher thought.
But it's cursed with this monstrous appearance that make people fear it.
And he tells Victor to create for him a mate. At first, Victor agrees, but then he becomes terrified of the prospect of creating a new race of
demons,
superhuman monsters. That he runs away
to the Arctic.
That's when the monster kills his friend. Yeah, and it ends with him chasing the monster through the Arctic. Spoiler alert.
Yeah. Well, I like... The Arctic element is very fascinating to me because I love Arctic exploration. Mm-hmm. That is a big interest of mine. The fascination with that and, like, all the kind of myths surrounding that at the time period. Like, people used to think that the Earth was hollow, and if you got to the North Pole, you could go through the center of the Earth and come out the other side. Like, the Arctic kind of was very representative of it. Was like the final frontier, basically. Mm-hmm. It was the last place that hadn't been fully explored.
But yeah, look how many expeditions there were through the Arctic, through the Antarctic.
Like Shackleton, like that, like Shackleton's ship was recently discovered, within the past 10 years. All that stuff was happening at the time because Arctic was the final frontier. That was the final unexplored bits of the Earth, the Arctic and the Antarctic. And that comes up in these mad science stories with going into the Arctic where, like, Victor ends up in the Arctic. But I just think it's really interesting that the Arctic is tied into a lot of these mad science stories because that was the science as a frontier. There were theories that if you got to the very North Pole, I like how I'm gesturing, no one can see me except for you. I'm gesturing wildly right now, just picture me making a globe with my arms. If you get to the North Pole, the Earth would be hollow. You could literally travel through the center of the Earth and come out the other side. That was a prevalent theory. There's also a theory that there was like a utopia. Like if you got to the very top of the Earth, the North Pole, there would be a hole there and you could go in there and there'd be preserved this utopian society and like we kind of like journey to the center of the Earth. Which we are not talking about in this video, but we will be talking about another Jules Verne adventure. But anyway, I just find that interesting as somebody who enjoys reading about Arctic expeditions, who are very often doomed, either due to their own hubris, lack of preparation, or literally just the elements would be so extreme, like even with all the preparation, they would just be caught off guard, and nature would destroy them.
Let's talk about the hubris aspect.
Yes, hubris.
That is applicable to our scientists here.
It's a big theme.
Brought up while we were just taking notes that Victor is the only one in our examples who's the protagonist of the story. I feel like I'm interviewing you. Maybe that would be a more fun format for these.
I'm the worst person to interview. My brain is not good.
Victor's the only protagonist of this story that we are using as an example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he is. He's not a very good protagonist, but he is technically the protagonist.
And he's not the only point of view character. He's the only protagonist of his story.
Like I feel like he is supposed to be somewhat sympathetic. You're not supposed to outright hate him.
Well, I don't hate him.
No. He's whiny, and he did create all of his problems that led to his death and multiple other people's deaths.
That was with the Arctic hubris. Lack of planning. He created this thing and then had no plan what to do with it, how to handle it, how to control it.
He was like, I can do it, so I'm going to.
This is our second big trope. Progress for the sake of progress.
And no thoughts to the ethical or moral implications.
Correct. So eventually this leads to his downfall, which was to the elements. Funnily enough.
Yes, God.
Going on with our Arctic expedition analogy here. He's hit all of those pitfalls that you've mentioned.
He is, I guess, taking responsibility in that he's recounting his story to the person who found him. But, and he does pay the price, right? It does die.
Mm-hmm.
And you could say that's, God balancing the scales, or the earth, or the universe, whatever, balancing the scales.
Every single one of our examples does eventually have a downfall. And it's usually as a direct result of whatever their main experiment or scientific endeavor is. Should we move on to the next one then?
Yeah, I think we've rung Frankenstein for
we discussed
everything he's got.
I mean, he's by far the most well-known example on the
he's
list.
Probably the most influential, too.
Well, he was the first.
He was the first, being the first kind of science fiction, very staple horror novel.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so next will be Dr. Jekyll.
Very well known.
Robert Louis Stevenson.
We were discussing this earlier. This was definitely off camera. The version that most people see of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, or what's emphasized in retellings of that story, is not what the story actually is.
Coincidentally enough, I think this is our second most well-known scientist.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? Everyone is very familiar with the concept of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, where you have a good side of your personality, a nice person, a pleasant person, and then on the flip side, there's this ugly, mean, malevolent aspect, but they're both the same person.
Yes, and I think there's an element there too of the concept of sin. A lot, and I don't want to get too into religious doctrine with this, but people say hate the sin, love the sinner, where you're separating the badness from the person. And in this story, literally, they're like two separate people. Like, it's one person, but in one form, this person is good. And he takes a potion, or serum, whatever. Mm-hmm. He's a scientist.
It's a serum.
So it's a serum, it's not a potion. He drinks this magic drink, and then he becomes the sinner, essentially.
Right. But wasn't he, now I may be misremembering, when we were recapping it earlier, he wanted to become the second person so he could indulge in his darker impulses.
Yes, like that's the other thing. He's like, I'm a good guy, but I have all these dark desires, and I just want to do it.
So he basically is trying to absolve himself, the person that everyone around him sees, Dr. Jekyll.
Mm-hmm.
He's trying to keep up this persona, so by creating this alter ego, that character can be the one who takes all the blame for all his wrongdoings. He's trying to circumvent responsibility, again, for his own actions, by literally becoming someone else.
And, it works for a little bit, but then, he gets caught, Mr. Hyde kills a guy. And he in the original story, the emphasis of the story is more about how he slowly starts to lose control, where he can no longer control the transformations, they start happening randomly, or he can't switch back, and it takes more and more of the serum to control it, versus in a lot of modern retellings, or even just where Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde show up as characters, the emphasis is not on losing control, it's the duality.
Right.
Whereas the story itself is about a man creates a monster out of himself and slowly starts to lose control of the monster, aka himself, ultimately ending in
his downfall.
Demise. He's definitely not really a protagonist either. The story itself is kind of told from the point of view of his friend Utterson, who's trying to figure out what the hell's going on. Kind of like a mystery, but then
he demonstrates these things that we talked about with Frankenstein. He has a lack of responsibility, a lack of ethics. He doesn't really consider what basically separating all the bad parts of himself into one singular character and giving that persona control of his body, the implications for everyone else and himself.
Yeah, and I also think there's something so arrogant, maybe arrogant's not the right word, but the idea of, I have all these urges and I want to give in to them, but I don't want to suffer the consequences. So instead of maybe, working on himself or trying to be a better person, no, I don't care who gets hurt or what these impulses are. I'm gonna let them out.
And eventually he loses control of this. In order to undo the transformations, he has to use more and more and more of the serum, similar to the way an addiction works.
Yeah, I think there's the strongest parallel that pops out to me is the parallel to addiction, because it talks a lot about how at first it feels really good, it's going really well, slowly, it starts to take over his life. You need more and more of the substance to reach that same high. You think about it all the time. It starts changing you. You act differently. It's changing the way you make your decisions, the way you live your life. Obviously, in the story of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, ultimately does end in his downfall. Whereas, if you're actually suffering a real life addiction, hopefully you can get help. Another thing you could say is that it could also be an allegory for queerness, because there's a line in the book where Dr. Jekyll is like, well, there's stuff that I've done as Mr. Hyde that I can't even tell you. That's not murdering, because he's admitting to, the murder, hurting people, whatever.
So sexual deviance.
Sexual deviance, which at the time it was written was very...
Well, just the fact that it's considered deviance.
Yes.
Right?
And obviously you can make that allegory. I prefer not to, because obviously there's murder involved, so let's just separate the queerness from the murder. But you could make that argument. And I think, too, horror is a very queer genre.
Yeah, this was also the 1880s.
Yes.
So, people didn't talk about that kind of stuff.
No, even if that was the purpose, it wasn't going to be talked about. But I had to make the parallel.
It's also maybe what he had in mind when he wrote that line. Stuff like, oh, what can I make people think of that's even worse?
Yeah.
Than murder.
And not put it on the page.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, what can I say that would kind of get their imagination going? What kind of really depraved, horrible things will my reader come up with to fill in the blanks here?
Yeah, and that's true. That's another, if you just give the audience enough to let their imagination take it, would probably be worse than anything he could have written.
We're 2 for 2 for dead scientists.
Well, we don't find out how Mr. Hyde dies. Jekyll just says in his letter, I'm gonna be dead. Whether Mr. Hyde is, arrested by the authorities or kills himself, it's not my fault. It's not my problem. I'm dead. Peace out.
Even though it was his body. So.
Even though it was his body and his creation, he still did not take responsibility. He's like, whatever happens to Mr. Hyde, that's not me.
Yeah, the only thing I would really say that he lacks is that kind of godlike mentality.
Yeah.
He wasn't trying to create something to put himself on level with a god.
He was basically just trying to skirt the moral
But he did demonstrate a lack of morality and a lack of ethics.
Yes.
Should we move on to our third scientist? This is going to be a lesser known one. This is Robert
the Conqueror. Such a good name.
He's not creating life. He's not mixing serums. He's not changing his body in any way, but he is building fantastic and seemingly impossible machines. So he's an engineer of sorts.
We are talking about, I keep forgetting what this one's called.
Master of the World.
Master of the World by Jules Verne.
I was getting there.
Oh, okay. I wasn't sure if you'd forgot.
This was my lead up.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Continue. Pretend I didn't interrupt.
Well, anyway, so Robert appears in 2 of Jules Verne's works. Robert the Conqueror in the first one, and Master of the World, which is the sequel. In Robert the Conqueror, he's built a flying machine. If I remember correctly, the description of it in the book sounds something like a helicopter. And then in Master of the World, he has created a machine that can go on land, sea, and in the air.
Is there a word for that?
I don't know, because I don't think that's possible.
No.
Today, a car that can also become a submarine that can also fly.
Yeah, usually it's 2, it's not 3.
Yeah, we have amphibious vehicles.
Amphibious, yeah, that's the word I was
We
looking
have
for.
planes that can land on water. They're not submersible, though. This was submersible. This was a submarine, a plane, and a car.
Yeah, it's very James Bond.
The main character of this one, he's sent to the mountains because there's this mountain they think might be a volcano, and there's all kinds of lights and smoke and rumblings, but it never erupts. So it's very strange, and no one can get into the crater to see what's in there. Robert is building his curious machine, which he eventually flies out of the mountain with, and is just zooming all around the country in his car, and it's so fast that no one can see what it is. And then they see this mysterious submarine, but no one can approach it, and so on. And all these governments are offering him tons and tons of money because this would be a huge military advantage, because that's what governments think about. He says no, because he is going to be the master of the world.
Yeah, hence the Conqueror in his name. Hubris.
Oh, his hubris gets him in a big way. Eventually, our detective ends up on the boat, and they're cruising through Lake Erie.
Great Lake.
The Coast Guard, I think it was, from Buffalo is trying to catch up to them. But you know what they're going to do to get away? They're going to sail right off the Niagara Falls.
You can't do that. That's dangerous.
Nope, they just fly right off.
Oh.
And then they end up in the Atlantic, like in the Caribbean.
Mm-hmm.
And Robert decides that he's going to prove once and for all how godlike and unbeatable he is. And he flies straight into a hurricane.
And is never heard from again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
At the end of the day, nature wins.
Yeah.
Similar to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the protagonist of this one is kind of like investigating the mystery. But like you said, the biggest difference between this and the other stories is the mad scientist is not messing with life. He's creating a machine. But at the end of the day, he's still trying to play God, right?
Yes.
So the universe is like,
Yeah, basically he's trying to master the elements, right? Like I can create something that will ensure, even like if you think about this from a military standpoint, I will ensure my own victory over land, sea, and air. He basically created the ultimate military vehicle, which is why all the governments of the world wanted it.
He was the Avatar.
Built it in maybe a volcano, so there's your fire element.
Yeah, relating it to The Last Airbender, you know, the Fire Nation had all their machines and stuff.
Yeah.
Also, just another random... Jules Verne loved volcanoes. There's one in Journey to the Center of the Earth. There's one here. He's very into volcanic...
Jules Verne enjoyed vehicles.
Yeah, also very into vehicles.
Flying machines, hot air balloons, submarines.
Yeah, his science fiction is a lot less
it's like
flesh and blood.
Yeah, they're adventure stories.
Yeah. But yeah, at the end of the day, we still have the same elements. We still have the hubris being his downfall.
Yeah. And he was, a societal outcast because he considered himself so much better than everyone else, and he wanted to prove how much better he was than everyone else, how much smarter.
Funnily enough, people don't take kindly when you try to conquer them. It's not generally someone's favorite thing.
No.
Like, if someone walked up to me and was like, "Hi, my name's Robert the Conqueror,"
Rober
the Conqueror, I would be like, okay, I'm gonna go somewhere else now. Like, I'm gonna go far away and potentially call the police. That's suspicious.
Yeah, he's not quite as unethical as other people, but he did kidnap a few guys.
Yeah.
He just zoomed around the countryside with no regard for traffic law.
Implication of if he was gonna conquer the world, there would probably be some moral and ethical issues with that. But no human or animal experimentation.
But should we get into the animal experimentation?
I suppose we should.
H.G. Wells. The Invisible Man. This one is very well known, I think, again, because of the Universal film.
Yeah.
The Invisible Man, starring Claude Rains.
Pretty cool film.
It is a good
There's some
good movie.
cool effects in there.
The movie is fairly close to... It's not really a full novel, it's a novella.
Yeah.
He goes to an inn, he harasses the innkeeper, he's very angry, he's very invisible. The animals, he had been experimenting, he'd been trying to create a serum that would turn him invisible, so he was experimenting with this on his neighbor's cat.
As you do. That's a very normal, clearly not a psychopath at all.
Meanwhile, his landlord kept trying to get him to pay the rent, and he responded by burning the building down.
As you do. So clearly this is a very well-adjusted man.
Very normal thought processes going on here.
Yep. Hangs out at the local pub and rubs elbows with his fellow man.
So after getting angry at the innkeeper, getting mad because he keeps wrecking the room and not paying for anything, and eventually spills the beans on his invisibility, so he's forced to escape the townsfolk.
The funniest thing about it is he has to get naked to escape and fight them off.
Yes. So his next plan of action is to go bully a homeless man into being his errand boy.
Yeah, clearly this guy's not a very upstanding citizen.
He gives this homeless man all his notes, which are all written in a cryptic cipher that no one can read anyway. The man eventually, he tries to escape and he runs into this pub. Then we encounter, I think, the best Victorian Gothic trope, the American.
Ah, yes.
There's an American in this English pub, and he just so happens to have a pistol, because why wouldn't you?
Well, I mean, you're American, obviously you have a pistol.
Yeah.
Well, it's like peak cowboy times, though.
Yeah, everyone in America's a cowboy, clearly. So the American fires at the Invisible Man. He does hit him, and the Invisible Man daggers into the home of someone we find out was one of his former university mates. And that's where he explains everything. Gives the whole backstory until how we got to this point. And then he tells his mate that he's going to terrorize the whole country, because he's invisible and he can do that.
Yeah, that's one of the very literal, depiction of I can, so I will. No thought of why or what that means.
Yeah, and then I'm gonna conquer the country because I'm invisible because...
Well, he was already terrorizing this little town.
Mm-hmm.
Like, burned down a building, killed his neighbor's cat, being a horrific tenant to this innkeeper, like...
Obviously, his university mate tries to tell the authorities.
Yeah.
And you know what? Our Invisible Man, he does have a name. His name was Griffin.
Pretty cool name.
You know how he responds to this? He murders the constable.
As you do.
He's gonna kill his former friend now, and they chase him into the town where the townsfolk meet him, and he is beaten to death. And as he dies, he becomes visible.
The end.
Here, we touched on, I think, a bit of everything. Definite arrogance.
Yep, lack of morals, lack of ethics.
Mm-hmm. No planning, no preparedness whatsoever. And he mentioned this too, like he went outside and it was snowing and basically he realized the mistake he made because he can't wear clothes because people will see him. He can't walk around in bad weather because the rain showed the outline of his body. He was leaving muddy footprints everywhere he went. As soon as he had done the thing, he realized that there were all these different downsides to it.
Yeah.
That he had to come up with more horrible ways to terrorize people in order to come around them. So he was stealing things from stores because he couldn't go into anywhere now because he was invisible. When you're invisible, you can't just shop.
No, you can't buy things like a normal person.
No, he ended up in a costume shop. There was an apartment over it, and the person who owned the shop and lived there kept obviously hearing noises, so he would try to figure out what was going on, and it ended up with this poor man tied up in his own attic while the Invisible Man stole costume pieces.
That's horrible. What a jerk.
That was not a likable person in the slightest. Aside from the fact he tried to further remove all the pigment from his body, even though he was albino, which was...
When you spend the entire story invisible and use it as a justification to do horrendous things.
So yeah, pride, lack of ethics, downfall. We see this pattern repeating over and over and over. So we're now 4 for 4 with dead scientists. You ready for the last one?
I'm ready. Oh
All
boy.
Right. Island of Dr. Moreau.
Yes.
Also by H.G. Wells.
Very famous, very disturbing story.
That's one way to put it.
Honestly, and I think this one is the most disturbing to me conceptually.
The animal abuse?
Animal abuse.
So we are back to trying to play God. Dr. Moreau does vivisection, which just essentially means he does surgical alterations on living animals, trying to surgically make them into humans. Does that make any sense to a sane person?
No.
No, an animal is not a human because... And it's not necessarily due, I mean, obviously, like, their body is totally different, but their mental capacity is totally different. But somehow, through these surgeries and experiments, they also gained intelligence. Human intelligence.
Yeah, awareness.
Yeah.
Yeah, self-awareness. Going back to the alchemy thing, trying to turn one thing into another.
Well, kind of the big idea behind Dr. Moreau was, like, forced evolution. So you're trying to speed along the process, supposedly, where these different life forms would become a higher life form.
To man is the highest life form. That again brings into play the whole trying to be God thing.
Right. This did not go over well with the people of London, so he was kicked out of town, and that's why he was doing his experiments on this remote island.
Where none of the authorities could chase him down.
Precisely. There was no one around to judge him. Now, our main character ends up on the island because he's shipwrecked, and he's picked up by a boat that's taking a bunch of new animals to Moreau's island. And that's where he meets Dr. Moreau, he meets his assistant, and he meets his assistant's assistant, who is one of these animals that has been turned into a person-like being. He describes a lot of the different, I guess I'll just call them people, for the sake of talking about him. He describes most of them as just being very strange, very ugly. He isn't really able to describe what animals some of them started off as, but some of them were quite evident. For example, there was like a leopard man, and there was a sloth man, and a dog man.
So just basically whatever animal he could get.
And he kind of like makes friends with some of them. He gets chased down by the leopard man at one point. And the animal people have to have this really strict set of rules that Moreau enforces through fear and intimidation in order to keep them from basically acting on their actual animal instincts.
Yes, yeah.
So there's this whole list of rules that they're constantly reciting, like they aren't to eat meat. They are not to drink while on all fours. Stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
So he really enforces this idea of forcing them to act as human-like as possible. But, of course, as the story goes on, they are reverting. This isn't an actual evolutionary step. It's an artificial one. You want to guess what happens to Dr. Moreau?
He's killed by his own creation?
He sure is. One of the animals on the ship that brought the main character was a puma that Dr. Moreau attempts to turn into a woman. And she escapes, and Moreau runs after her into the jungle, and they both end up dead. His assistant and his assistant's assistant also are killed by some of these animal people in a scuffle on the beach. And then the entire house burns down, which forces the main character to go and live with animal people for the remainder of the story. And he does so until they start reverting so far into their normal way of being that he's basically so terrified he has to find a way off the island before they kill him.
I was also thinking, too, the whole idea of, Moreau forcing them to follow these rules and stuff. To be something they're not. Kind of reminds me of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Except division between quote-unquote man and beast. Here, beast is what they are, right? Like, they didn't, unlike Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, it's not like they chose this. It's not like they're like, hey, we want to be self-aware.
Yeah.
And whatever. Like,
I don't think that anything would choose that.
No.
Would it entail?
I wouldn't. Give it, I don't want it. Take it back. But yeah, so it's just interesting because it's kind of like the flip side. Like, it's a similar idea, but it's done in such a different way, and it's so much more grotesque because it is this man playing God. Especially, like, he's on his own little island, like, it's secluded. He's literally the top of the hierarchy there. He's exerting his self-given authority, whatever, playing God over these people. Whereas Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, like, he does it to himself. And, like, he does end up hurting other people, but he was the one who did it. Whereas this guy is inflicting it upon all these people. But no innocents were harmed, arguably.
No, except for all the animals.
Except for the animals, but I mean, the animals were harmed by Dr. Moreau, but then Dr. Moreau gets what's coming to him.
He does.
Well, and I guess the Puma lady dies.
Yes. After suffering horribly through much of the story.
Well, as a woman in Gothic, sadly, that is often the fate of female characters.
Yeah, I mean, the reason why the main character even leaves the house in the first place is because he can hear the puma screaming, and that's how he finds this whole, like, society of animal people.
Well, and that also, I think, implicates him. If you witness an injustice and you don't do anything, stop it. Like, he's hearing this screaming. I mean, yeah, you could argue he probably is not in a position to do much. However, he doesn't try.
Not really.
He accepts it. He's just like, hey, guy, you're kind of being a jerk there. Oh, you don't want to stop? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, what happens to him is he gets back to England and basically no one believes him and thinks that he's crazy, so he can never tell anybody about his story. Entire conflict, and then he has to live by himself by the sea in order to find peace, because people suck.
That's kind of a mood.
Yeah.
To be fair. Yeah, so then his reward is isolation.
It was a very depressing story. There was not...
So then he goes through all this, whatever, he gives up humanity, essentially.
Yeah.
Well, and I guess, like, the moral there, right, is, like, you can't change nature. Like, you can't force a puma to be a person.
No.
Physically, morally, ethically.
No. So, again, Dr. Moreau, playing God. Hurting living creatures.
Yep.
His pride is his downfall, thinking he will next create the most perfect artificial human, and that's eventually what kills him.
This story is the darkest to me. Like, I know, Frankenstein, he's, he takes a bunch of dead people and he makes a monster out of dead people, whatever. Like,
but they weren't alive anymore.
No.
They weren't suffering as he did
They weren't experiencing it. Obviously, that's wrong to rob graves. But they weren't alive. They weren't feeling pain. But the animals... were feeling pain, so it's just gross. And at least in Robert the Conqueror, he made a machine. No animals were harmed in the making
of his machine.
Yeah.
No. Yeah, so progress at any cost. Forcing all of these things, trying to go against the natural laws of the world.
Balance is always restored in the end. And I also think another thing that usually happens too is like things burn down. The research is lost, or like in The Invisible Man, like no one could read his notes.
Yeah, Dr. Moreau's house burnt down, all his research was lost. Rober's machine was lost in the hurricane.
Yeah.
I think they found like pieces of it. So they would never understand how it worked because it was destroyed.
Yeah, and the creator was also destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Frankenstein, all of his stuff was lost. And The Invisible Man. That's it,
yeah,
right? Yeah, that's what... Yeah.
The only one he did is talk about Dr. Jekyll.
Oh, yeah, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, yeah, because... Well, and he says, too, in his letter, I think he's like, he had the formulas and stuff, but, like, the salt, he ran out of salt and tried to get more, but it didn't work with the second kind of salt or whatever. So it couldn't be replicated, because, like, it was just, like, a fluke of whatever batch of whatever ingredient he had. So I think that's kind of an important thing, too, because literally, and plus with the fire is very cleansing, literally burns it out of existence, cannot be recreated.
Which is probably for the best.
Yes, extremely for the best.
It's not usually for the best, but in these stories, it definitely is.
And I think that idea, too, comes up a lot in modern mad scientist stories.
Mm-hmm.
Of, we cannot let this, whatever.
Yeah, that's, I guess the basis for any, like, sci-fi horror is you've got some technology that can't be controlled, or if this falls in the wrong hands. All of these stories, too, they kind of play on, like, the fear of society at large at the time.
Yeah.
Especially because we talked a lot about Victorian era stories.
Mm-hmm.
So the Victorian era, especially because you had like Darwin's theories
evolution,
becoming very prevalent, and you had the beginning of this real conflict between science and religion, and there was a lot of technological advance made very quickly with like the use of electricity and vehicles.
Well, in the industrial
revolution, like things started moving very quickly, and I think a lot of these stories, they represent the idea of taking things too far.
Yeah, and the very real possibility, because like that possibility still exists today. It's just obviously as time goes on, stretches of our imagination and what is physically possible just move. But it's still the same, like, in modern mad science stories, modern horror, modern gothics, whatever, like...
Well, modern stories, too, also have the influence of a very specific world event.
Yes.
Being the Second World War.
Yes.
Where you had the coming of the nuclear age.
That's very true.
The possibility of complete destruction of the world through nuclear power.
Total annihilation.
And then you also had some very infamous scientists who were real people conducting experiments on live humans. Yeah. So you have, those anxieties now becoming real. Mm-hmm. Like, that's a very real possibility that you could see a single weapon destroy entire cities. Kind of reflect it, especially in film. We haven't really watched a lot of sci-fi movies. Mm-mm. Yeah, but in film, especially when you had the science fiction of the 50s and the 60s, and then you have space exploration becoming a really big theme, and all these really wild technologies that people are dreaming up. Not necessarily in the mad scientist way, but science fiction as a genre really takes off.
There is just inherently a fine line between mad science and science fiction. One is never far from the other, because we, as people, we fear change.
Yes.
And horror as a genre is often, Gothic in particular, is very reactionary to stuff that's going on. Yeah, mad science in particular just reflects the most accurately current kind of existential fears. It's hard to think existentially about something that was published like 200 years ago, but not 200 years ago, you know what I mean.
No, Frankenstein was 200 years ago. That was first published in 1818. So I was correct. That was over 200 years ago.
Over 200 years ago. It's hard to picture what their existential dread looked like.
No, but it's like the dread doesn't change. It's just the circumstances around it changes.
Yeah, which I think is why these stories are still so relatable.
And why this character...
They strike a chord.
This character trope doesn't evolve. The man does not change, the science does.
That's it. We still always got your hubris. Consequences... Playing God, failing miserably.
I think that's a good place to wrap this up.
Well, this has been the Gothic Chit Chat Mad Science edition. Hope you enjoyed. If there's anything we missed, any stories you think we should have discussed or should discuss in the future, leave a comment down below. I'm pointing, you can't see me, but leave a comment for us. Tell us what you thought, and we'll see you in the next one.
Yep.
Whatever that may be. All right, bye. See you later.
Bye.
Toodles.